At 6 in the morning, while Ethan Cole was on one knee tying his daughter's shoelaces before school, a black car rolled to a stop in front of his worn-down house. A woman stepped out cold, composed, belonging to a world entirely different from his. Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Industries. She looked straight at him and said, "It's time for you to repay what you owe me." Ethan froze. He had never met her before, yet something in her eyes, in her voice, felt like a demand for a secret buried for 10 years. Ethan had been 38 years old for 3 months, and in that time, nothing significant had changed. He drove the same second-hand pickup he'd owned since Lily was a toddler, carried the same canvas bag of tools to every service call, and came home to the same 2-bedroom house on Dunmore Street that he rented from a landlord who cashed checks promptly and never asked questions. His official title was HVAC technician. In practice, he was the man people called when the heat went out in January, and every other repair service had a 2-week wait. He was good at it, not in the way people say to be polite, but genuinely, mechanically gifted. He understood systems. He could hear a compressor and know within seconds what was wrong with it. His coworkers called it instinct. Ethan called it paying attention. He had not always lived this way. At 22, he had been 2 semesters from finishing an engineering degree at a state university, accumulating credits with the sort of focused intensity that made his professors take notice. Then his mother got sick. The tuition bills stacked up faster than his part-time wages could address them, and the university's financial office ran out of patience before she ran out of hospital visits. He left school without ceremony, without a diploma, and without telling anyone he was doing so. He simply stopped going. He found work, found more work, and somewhere in the middle of all that work, he married a woman named Claire, who left when Lily was 2 years old. She was not a villain. She was simply someone who had wanted a different life, and she had gone to find it. Ethan did not chase her. He kept Lily, kept his tools, and kept moving. The box was what told the full story. If anyone had thought to look, it sat on the top shelf of his closet behind a winter jacket he never wore. A shoebox held shut with a rubber band, containing a handful of papers from his university years, a technical notebook filled with diagrams in his own hand, and a photograph that had been torn cleanly in half. He never opened it when Lily was awake. On the rare nights she slept early, he would sometimes take it down, set it on the kitchen table, and look at the torn edge of the photograph for a long time before putting it back. He never explained it to anyone, because no one had ever asked. Victoria Hale did not wait to be invited inside. She moved up the porch steps with the unhurried confidence of someone accustomed to having her presence treated as permission enough. Behind her, still positioned near the car, stood 2 men in dark coats who were watching the street with the flat, professional attention of people paid to watch streets. Ethan's neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Oakes, had already appeared in her doorway across the road, arms folded, openly curious. The whole scene was a collision glossy and structured on one side, worn and ordinary on the other. Lily pressed herself to Ethan's side and peered around him at the woman. Children have a different register for reading people. Where adults see clothing and posture and measure threat, children measure something less definable. Lily studied the woman for a full 3 seconds and then reached out and took hold of her hand. Just like that. Unprompted, unasked. Victoria Hale looked down at the small fingers wrapped around 2 of hers, and for one brief, unguarded instant, something moved across her face. Not softness exactly, but a fracture in the composure, a flicker of something old. She recovered quickly. She released Lily's hand with gentle precision, turned back to Ethan, and reached into the inner pocket of her coat. She produced a small item and held it out between 2 fingers. It was a necklace, a thin, silver chain with a circular pendant, the kind of thing that cost very little and meant a great deal. Ethan's eyes dropped to it, and the color in his face changed. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. "You recognize it," Victoria said. It was not a question. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "I've had it for 10 years, she said. I was wearing it the night someone pulled me out of a wreck on Route 19 and disappeared before the ambulance arrived. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. The morning birds were making noise in the elm tree at the edge of the yard. Lily was watching her father with the focused concern of a child who understands that something is happening without understanding what. "I don't know what you think I took from you," Ethan said finally. Victoria slipped the necklace back into her pocket. "You took 10 years, she said, "and I intend to have an accounting." 10 years was not the kind of time that softened cleanly into story. For Ethan, it had happened in a rush and then in a blur. He had been driving back from a night shift on a cold November evening, eastbound on Route 19, when his headlights caught the shape of a car folded against the guardrail at the bottom of a curve. He had pulled over without thinking. The driver's door was jammed. He had used a tire iron from his truck bed to force it open, reached in, and pulled the woman out. She was conscious but disoriented, her forehead cut, her seatbelt leaving a bruise across her shoulder that would darken for days. He had laid her on the embankment, checked her breathing, confirmed she was stable, and then heard the distant sound of another vehicle slowing on the highway above. He had run, not because he lacked care, but because he lacked options. At that point in his life, he owed the university $11,000 in unpaid fees, and there was an administrative garnishment order tied to his name. He had been warned that any police contact, even incidental, could trigger a wage seizure that would end his ability to make rent. He was not proud of the decision. He had told himself she was breathing, she was conscious, help was seconds away. He had driven home in the dark and not spoken of it to anyone for 10 years. He had not known her name. He had not known anything about her except that she was alive when he left. Standing in his own hallway now, Ethan looked at Victoria Hale, the composed, calculating woman who ran a technology conglomerate with 3,700 employees, and understood that the woman on the embankment and the woman before him were the same person. He also understood, from the specific quality of her expression, that she had not come to thank him. "I know you left," she said. "I know why you left eventually, but before I knew why, something of mine went missing." She paused. "And you were the last person near it." The accusation, when it came in full, was precise and serious. On the night of the accident, Victoria had been returning from a private meeting where she had finalized the foundational architecture for what would become Hale Industries' core proprietary system, a thermal regulation and predictive load technology that had, in the 12 months following its commercial release, changed the company from a mid-tier manufacturer into a $200 million enterprise. The design had been saved to a USB drive on her keychain. After the accident, the keychain was recovered from the wreck. The USB drive was not. The technology had appeared in the market 18 months later, licensed through an intermediary firm to 3 separate contractors. The patents had been structured carefully enough to avoid direct comparison. But Victoria's legal team had found the through lines, and they had traced the chain of custody back, imperfectly but insistently, toward the night of Route 19. The only person unaccounted for was the one who had been there and vanished. Ethan listened to all of this standing in his kitchen. He had poured coffee not because he wanted it, but because it gave his hands something to do. Victoria sat at his table with the still, arranged posture of someone conducting a formal proceeding, not a conversation. "I did not steal anything from you," he said. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I'm here because I need the matter resolved. My lawyers have advised against this approach. I came anyway." She looked at him steadily. "I need you to come to my offices. Whatever happened, the answer is somewhere between your memory and my records." Ethan looked at the window above the sink. "The school bus would come in 11 minutes. He looked back at her. "My daughter has school," he said. "I'm aware," Victoria said. "I'll have you back by noon." The headquarters of Hale Industries occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in the downtown financial corridor. Ethan arrived in his pickup, parked in a visitor space between a silver sedan and a luxury SUV whose sticker price probably exceeded his annual income, and walked into the lobby in his cleanest work pants, and a dark jacket he normally saved for Lily's school concerts. The lobby receptionist looked at him with a practiced pleasantness that did not quite conceal the measurement happening behind it. He gave his name. She made a call. He waited on a low bench beneath a very large piece of abstract art that he suspected cost more than his truck. He was escorted upstairs by a young man in a fitted suit who walked 3 paces ahead and did not attempt small talk. The elevator opened onto a floor that was all open space and deliberate light glass partitions, white surfaces, the hum of efficient machinery. People moved with the quick, purposeful energy of those who believe their time is expensive. Several of them glanced at Ethan, registered his presence as anomalous, and returned to their screens. He was brought to a conference room where he did not expect to find a crisis already in progress. But there were 9 people around a long table, and the tension in the room had the particular density of a problem that had been getting worse for several hours. Diagrams were projected on a screen, dense, technical, the kind of schematic that required years of training to parse. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her expression flat in the way that indicated she was suppressing something larger. She looked at Ethan when he entered, then said something low to an aide, who directed him to a chair along the wall. He was clearly not meant to participate. He was meant to wait. He sat, and he watched. The problem on the screen was a load distribution model for a climate control system running across a multi-building campus. One of the contractors had reported cascading failures during the simulation phase, and the team was methodically working through the architecture to find the fault. They were 15 minutes into a correction when Ethan's eyes moved across the projection and stopped. He leaned forward slightly. He looked again. His expression did not change. The team proposed a patch. There was general agreement. The lead engineer began typing. Ethan stood up. "That's the wrong fix," he said. The room went quiet. 9 faces turned toward him. Victoria looked at him from the head of the table with an expression that was not anger. Exactly more like someone who has just seen a variable they hadn't included in their equation. The aide near the door took a half-step forward. "Sir, you're not. The fault isn't in the distribution node," Ethan said. "It's in the thermal lag coefficient in the tertiary input loop. If you patch the node, you'll correct the symptom for approximately 72 hours and then produce a failure 3 times the scale of the current one." Silence. "You're fixing the wrong thing," he said again, quietly. Victoria looked at her lead engineer. The engineer looked at the projection. He pulled up a secondary schematic, scrolled to the tertiary input specifications, and went still. He checked it again. His face did something complicated. "He's right," the engineer said. It took 40 minutes to implement the correct solution. Ethan sat at the table, a chair had been quietly relocated for him, and walked the team through it in clear, patient language, pointing to each component, explaining the cascading logic, answering questions without impatience or performance. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are not trying to impress anyone, when the information simply exists in them and they are giving it out. When it was done, when the simulation ran clean and the numbers settled where they were supposed to settle, the room had a different feeling in it. Relief mixed with something more uncomfortable, a collective awareness that they had been close to a very expensive mistake. The team filed out. Victoria did not move. She stood at the far end of the table, looking at Ethan with an expression he could not immediately categorize. Not gratitude. Not suspicion. Something with more weight than either. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. "Engineering program," he said. "I didn't finish. But thermal systems were what I was specializing in. The design you just corrected," she said slowly, "uses a load-balancing logic that I developed. The specific architecture of that tertiary loop, it's not standard. It's proprietary. No textbook has it." Ethan held her gaze. "Then how do you explain the fact that I recognized it?" It was the question neither of them could answer cleanly. Victoria stared at him for a long time. Then she said, with a precision that suggested she was being very careful about her word choice, "Either you designed it, or you know someone who did." The answer came from a shoebox on a closet shelf. Ethan went home, got Lily from school, made her lunch, and then sat with her at the kitchen table while she worked through her math homework. When she was done and settled in front of her book, he climbed to the top shelf of the closet and brought down the box. He did not open it at the table. He opened it, standing in the hallway, with the afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the corridor, and he sorted through the papers until he found what he was looking for: a USB drive, still in the small plastic sleeve in which he'd stored it years ago. He had found it on the ground near the wreck on Route 19, half hidden under a crushed pine branch, and he had pocketed it automatically in the dark and the urgency of the moment. He had not connected it to the woman. He had not known what it contained. He had placed it in the box with the other things he hadn't known what to do with, and over 10 years, it had simply remained there, untouched, unopened, carrying its contents sealed and intact. He brought it to Victoria's offices the following morning. Her technical director ran a forensic access log on the drive in front of both of them. The results were clean. The drive had never been accessed since the night it was created. The data was original, uncopied, undistributed. Victoria studied the log for a long time without speaking. Then someone else had access to my designs, she said finally. Or had access to you, Ethan said. To your work. Long before that night, the weight of what he was suggesting settled into the room like cold air coming under a door. Graham Wells had been with Hale Industries since the beginning, a founding stakeholder with a reputation for strategic patience and a gift for making his interests invisible. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and consistently described in company documentation as an invaluable asset. He had been one of 3 people who reviewed Victoria's technical drafts in the year before the accident. He had also, Ethan later learned, quietly brokered the licensing deal through which her thermal architecture first entered the commercial market under a different name. The discovery did not happen all at once. It happened the way structural damage becomes visible not in a single crack, but in the pattern of cracks. The way they connect. The way the wall starts to tell you something about the foundation. Victoria's legal team had been looking in the wrong direction for a decade, and the reorientation took 2 days of intensive document review. Graham had been careful, but careful and thorough are different things, and he had underestimated the consequence of having the original USB drive available for comparison. When the legal team brought their preliminary findings to Victoria, Graham moved. He was not a man who panicked, but he was a man who acted quickly under pressure, and his first act was to distribute through 2 intermediaries a set of documents that placed Ethan's name alongside the licensing firm, constructed to suggest a consulting relationship that had never existed. It was not subtle work. It had been assembled fast, under stress, but it looked plausible at a distance, and Graham understood that distance was what he needed. The documents reached the conference room before Ethan arrived for the next scheduled meeting. Victoria stood at the head of the table, holding a folder and reading it with the careful stillness of someone trying to determine whether the floor beneath her is solid. Her lawyers were present. Graham sat at the far end of the table, his expression controlled, his hands folded. Ethan walked in, took the room's temperature in a glance, and sat down. It was Lily who changed the balance of the room. She had come with him that morning because her school had a half day and he hadn't arranged alternate care in time. She sat in the chair beside her father, her backpack on her lap, watching the adults with calm, serious eyes. When the folder was set in front of Ethan and he read through it, his name printed on forms he had never seen. Beside transactions he had never made, his face did not redden. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked up at the room and said, "This is a fabrication." Every line of it. Graham's response was measured and damning. He spoke of records, of timestamps, of corroborating sources that could be produced. He spoke with the confidence of someone who has prepared for this moment. The room began to tilt. Then Lily, who had been watching Graham with the kind of sustained attention that 8-year-olds bring to things they find confusing, said in a clear, unhurried voice, "My dad doesn't lie." Not angry, not performed. A simple, declarative statement of fact, offered the way children offer facts without strategy, without calculation. without any awareness of how much force a simple truth can carry when everything around it is complicated. Graham paused. Victoria looked at Lily. The room went quiet in a way that was different from the other silences of that morning. Victoria called a full board session for the following Thursday. She gave no explanation to Graham beyond the standard notice. She gave Ethan 3 days to compile everything the USB drive's forensic report, the original technical notebooks from his university years showing the independent parallel work he had done on thermal load systems, and a 40-minute recorded walkthrough in which he explained the architecture of the design in terms specific enough that only its creator could have produced. His explanation contained details that had never been documented publicly, corrections to documented versions, and 2 intentional errors that Victoria had embedded in the original design as a private test of comprehension. He identified both of them without prompting. The board session began at 9 in the morning. 18 people were present. Graham Wells was seated 3 chairs down from Victoria on the right side of the table. He did not know what was coming until Victoria's general counsel began speaking, and by then the documentation was already being distributed. The forensic timeline was presented first, then the licensing trail, then the access logs showing that Graham's personal credentials had been used to retrieve an archived copy of Victoria's original design files 6 weeks before the accident on Route 19. Then the 3 intermediary companies that traced, with clarity and specificity, back to a holding entity in which Graham held undisclosed interest. Graham spoke twice during the presentation. The first time, he offered a counter-narrative. The second time, he requested a recess. Both times, Victoria held up one hand and said, with the measured control of someone who had been waiting to speak for 10 years, "Let the record continue." When the evidence had been fully presented, the room was absolutely silent. 18 people were looking at one man, and the weight of 18 pairs of eyes on a prepared lie is a particular kind of justice. Victoria stood. She looked across the table at Ethan, who was seated at the far end near the windows, in the same dark jacket he'd worn on the day of the emergency meeting, the only formal thing he owned. "Ethan Cole came to this building as a man I believed had wronged me," she said. "He came without a lawyer, without leverage, and without anything to protect him except the truth." She paused. "I was wrong about him. I was wrong about the source of what was taken from me, and I was wrong to make him carry the weight of an accusation that was never his to carry." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry." Without qualification, Graham Wells was asked to resign before the session ended. He did so, in writing, in a room down the hall, while his attorney made calls. 3 days after the board session, Victoria came to Dunmore Street again. The morning was similar, cool, quiet, the elm tree shedding the last of its leaves. No car, no security detail. She walked from where she'd parked at the corner and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, the same place she had stood the first time. She was wearing a lighter coat. She looked, somehow, slightly less armored. Ethan was in the yard turning over the last of the garden bed. He had known she would come. He straightened up when he saw her, pushed the spade into the earth, and pulled off his gloves. "I have an offer," she said, when she was close enough to speak at a normal volume. "I figured," he said. She laid it out simply. The company needed a chief technology officer, someone who understood the core architecture from the inside, who had the capacity to protect it and build on it without the kind of blind institutional loyalty that had allowed Graham to operate undetected for a decade. The compensation was significant. The title was significant. The challenge was real. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I appreciate it. I don't want the title. And I don't need the number you're thinking." Victoria looked at him with something he was starting to recognize, the expression she wore when she was recalibrating. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "I want what I have," he said simply. "I want to pick Lily up from school. I want to know where she is when she's sick. I want to not be someone who trades that for a corner office." He looked at her with the direct, undeflected gaze of someone who has spent years knowing exactly what they value. I know what I gave up once because I needed money. I won't give up the rest of it because someone offers me more." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "You didn't owe me anything," she said. "You never did." "No," he agreed. "Then let me make an actual offer," she said. "Not a title, not a number. A real problem I can't solve without someone who thinks the way you think." She held his gaze. "Come in 3 days a week. Work on what actually matters. Go home when you need to go home." He considered this. He looked at the garden bed, at the elm tree, at the front door of the house where Lily was at that moment doing something that involved considerable noise and what sounded like a xylophone. 3 days, he said. 3 days, she confirmed. He was quiet for another moment, and then he did something she had not yet seen him do. He almost smiled. "You know you could have just asked," he said. "The first time." Victoria Hale, who had built a company on the principle that every resource should be marshaled with precision and intention, who had navigated boardrooms and acquisition talks and a decade of private suspicion. She looked at Ethan Cole, standing in his yard in mud-stained work pants, and she laughed. It was a brief laugh, surprised out of her rather than offered, and she caught it quickly, but it had been there. In the weeks that followed, something in the ordinary pattern of Dunmore Street changed quietly and without announcement. Ethan arrived at Hale Industries on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, took the elevator to the 6th floor, and worked in a corner space they had set up for him with the specific tools he'd asked for and nothing he hadn't. His colleagues, who had initially viewed him with the guarded uncertainty of people encountering an unknown variable, adjusted. He was not the kind of person who demanded adjustment. He simply worked, and the quality of his work made the adjustment happen on its own. On the other days, he was a man in a truck with a canvas tool bag, fixing the things that broke in houses and buildings that could not afford them to stay broken. He was, as he had always been, very good at it. Lily was the one who moved fastest. Children do not require narrative justification for attachment. Within 3 weeks, she had decided that Victoria was someone worth knowing, and she pursued that knowledge with the warm, relentless curiosity she brought to everything. She asked Victoria questions that no one had asked her in years, not about the company, not about strategy, but about whether she liked dogs, and what her favorite color was, and whether she had ever been on a boat. Victoria answered all of them with a directness that, in Lily's presence, stopped being cold and started being something else. One evening, on a Thursday, when the workday had run late and Ethan had brought Lily to the office rather than leave her with Mrs. Oakes, Victoria found them in the small kitchen on the 6th floor. Lily was explaining to her father, with great authority, the correct way to make hot chocolate. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment before either of them noticed her. Watching the two of them in the spare fluorescent light, the girl gesturing with precise 8-year-old confidence, the man nodding with the careful, genuine attention he gave to everything, Lily said. She had built something, over the course of the last decade, that was large and functional and hers. She had fought for it and protected it and rebuilt it after it was taken from her. But standing in that doorway, she felt the specific weight of what that decade had also cost the narrow focus. The defended perimeter, the years of suspicion that had made her very good at moving alone. She stepped into the kitchen. Lily looked up and offered her a mug. It was too sweet and not quite warm enough, and Victoria drank it without complaint. On a Saturday morning in late November, Victoria drove herself to Dunmore Street. She parked at the corner, walked to the house, and stood at the bottom of the porch steps for the 3rd time. The elm tree was bare now. The garden bed had been turned and mulched for winter. Somewhere inside, she could hear the television and Lily's voice narrating something with great enthusiasm. Ethan opened the door before she knocked. He was in a faded gray Henley and work boots, the same clothes he'd been wearing the first morning, or near enough to them that it felt like a symmetry. He looked at her with the quiet, steady expression that she had come to understand was not guarded, but simply honest, a man who had no interest in performing a version of himself. She did not have documents. She did not have an offer. She had, on the way over, rehearsed approximately 4 different opening lines, and standing here now, she understood that all of them were wrong. "Can I come in?" she said. The corner of Ethan's mouth moved. He looked at her for a moment, at the woman who had shown up at his door with the weight of 10 years and the certainty of someone who has been wronged, who had stood in a boardroom and told the truth in front of 18 people, who had drunk bad hot chocolate without mentioning it, who was standing now in the cold without armor. He stepped back and held the door open. From inside came the sound of Lily asking, with immediate and genuine excitement, if that was Victoria. Ethan looked back over his shoulder and said yes. Then he looked at Victoria, and the almost smile was there again, fuller this time, belonging completely to the moment. "She's going to ask you about boats again," he said. Victoria walked in out of the cold, and he closed the door behind her.